She never screamed. She never fought. She simply disappeared while still alive. A queen, erased not by death, but by silence. Her name was Ingeborg of Denmark, crowned Queen of France in a dazzling royal wedding, then banished the very next day. No crime, no trial, just a locked door, just a king who said, "I cannot live with her." She spent the next 20 years trapped in convent walls, her voice ignored, her letters unanswered, her body aging in darkness. Not dead, but not allowed to live. A ghost behind velvet curtains, still wearing the title of queen. Why did King Philip reject her so violently? Why did the church protest, yet fail to set her free? And how did a woman once meant to unite two kingdoms become the most forgotten queen in French history? This is not just a story of royal betrayal. It is a story of control, of silence as punishment, and of a woman whose suffering echoed louder than her voice ever could. She was born into frost. The winter of Denmark was not kind to the weak, and the child named Ingeborg was expected to be nothing less than strong. Born around 1175, daughter of King Valdemar I of Denmark, she was the product of Viking blood and northern virtue, a girl of icy poise and soft, resolute silence. From her earliest days, she was taught to walk beside power without fearing it. Denmark, though not as expansive as the Holy Roman Empire or as politically explosive as France, held its pride in maritime strength and dynastic purity. Ingeborg's brothers were warriors and kings-to-be. She, the youngest, was trained to be something far more delicate, but no less dangerous, a diplomatic offering, a royal bride. Ingeborg was fluent in multiple tongues before she was 15. Latin prayers fell from her lips like hymns. French came to her like a borrowed melody. She had the composure of a cathedral statue and the education of a scholar priestess. Her nannies whispered that she was born old, that there was wisdom in her eyes before there was even light. And so when King Philip II of France, one of the most powerful rulers of Western Europe, sent word that he sought a new wife, Denmark did not hesitate. Ingeborg was chosen, but not merely because she was young or beautiful. She was useful. Philip had recently lost his first wife, Isabella of Hainault, and with her, a secure alliance. His court mourned, but not for long. France needed heirs. France needed stability. And in Ingeborg, the king saw both a peaceful alliance with the Danish realm and a docile girl unlikely to cause trouble. Or so he thought. The journey south was long. Sails cracked against frozen air as Ingeborg left her homeland behind. Some said she cried during the crossing. Others claimed she held her breath when the French coast came into view, as if she sensed what was waiting. When she arrived in Amiens, the air was thick with pageantry. June 1193. The bells rang like war drums. Crowds pressed at the cathedral doors. France had a queen again. And for a moment, just a moment, Ingeborg smiled. She was 17, draped in silk, crowned with gold. Behind her stood Denmark, ahead of her the throne of France. She knelt beside Philip in sacred union. The coronation was public, blessed by the church, witnessed by bishops and nobles and scribes who would record every word. But they did not record what came next. The morning after the wedding, something broke. Philip, once solemn and stately, turned pale, then furious. He approached the bishops, the scribes, the Pope's own representatives, and made a bizarre, cold declaration. I cannot live with this woman. No explanation, no scandal, no evidence of treachery, witchcraft, or disloyalty. Just revulsion, disgust. He claimed their marriage had never been consummated, that she was cursed, that she was, in his words, incapable of marriage. Some courtiers whispered of dark arts. Others said she smelled of the sea like dead fish, like a northern curse come south to haunt French nobility. Some suspected witchcraft. A few dared to suggest something far more dangerous, that Philip was hiding his own impotence and blaming her to mask his shame. Ingeborg, barely 18, was removed from court, not divorced, not annulled, just hidden. Her belongings were taken, her attendants dismissed, her letters intercepted. She was no longer queen in function, though still queen by law. She had been Queen of France for one day, and now she was something far more terrifying. A silent inconvenience. Back in Denmark, her brother, King Canute VI, was outraged. He sent envoys, letters, demands. The Pope was equally appalled. Pope Celestine III declared the marriage valid and unbreakable. He issued orders. Philip must take Ingeborg back. But kings do not like to be told what to do, and Philip, once pious, now arrogant, refused. Instead, he began a legal farce. Gathering bishops loyal to him, he tried to annul the marriage on grounds of spiritual kinship, a claim so flimsy even medieval scholars scoffed. Meanwhile, Ingeborg waited. Her chambers were cold, her windows bricked over. She wrote letters by candlelight in the same Latin she once learned for diplomacy. But now, every word was a plea. I am your lawful wife. I was crowned by the hand of God. Why do you silence me? No reply. Outside, France marched on. Wars raged, castles burned, sons were born to other women. But within the cold stone of her exile, Ingeborg became a relic, alive but ignored, breathing but unseen. And in that breathless space between power and punishment, her tragedy began. June 15th, 1193. The bells of Amiens had not yet stopped ringing. The incense still clung to the cathedral pillars, and the velvet carpets had not been rolled up when the rumors began to hiss like steam under stone. Servants, wide-eyed and hushed, whispered of a commotion in the royal bedchamber. A scream, perhaps, or a slammed door, or nothing at all. Just a silence that felt too sharp to be peace. What happened that night has never been fully explained. But by the first light of morning, King Philip II of France emerged pale, sullen, and with a face like carved ash. He looked not like a man newly wedded, but one recently cursed. He summoned his closest clergy, and then, in a move that sent tremors through the crown and the cross alike, he declared that his marriage to Ingeborg of Denmark was void, unholy, unbearable. She repels me, he is reported to have said. I cannot live with her. I will not. There was no allegation of infidelity, no charge of witchcraft, no proof of illegitimacy. And yet, Philip refused to explain, not to his court, not to the Danish envoys, not even to the Pope. Behind closed doors, speculation festered. Some claimed Ingeborg had emitted an unclean odor, as if the salt of the North Sea clung to her skin like a curse. Others suggested a bodily deformity, a hidden physical flaw, discovered in horror during the wedding night. A few even whispered that Ingeborg was the victim of a political miscalculation. a bride Philip never truly wanted, forced upon him by eager advisors looking to shore up French-Danish relations. But none of these rumors held ground. Physicians examined Ingeborg. Clergy vouched for her piety. Her servants swore she had wept not in madness, but in confusion and grief. She had done nothing wrong, and yet her fate was already sealed. Within days of the wedding, Philip ordered her confined, not in chains, but in claustration. She was removed from court and housed in isolation. Her Danish ladies-in-waiting were dismissed. She was given no audience, no public appearance, no access to power or protest. He locked her away, not with iron bars, but with silence. Then he turned to the church. Philip, eager to be free of his unwanted queen, petitioned a local synod, a council of bishops loyal to him, to annul the marriage. His claim? That Ingeborg and he were related in the 7th degree of kinship. That their union was invalid before God. The bishops, under pressure and perhaps bribes, complied. But Pope Celestine III did not. In 1195, the papal court declared the annulment illegal, reaffirming that the marriage was valid and must be honored. Ingeborg, still legally Queen of France, was to be restored to her throne. The Pope sent envoys, letters, warnings. Philip burned them. And when Celestine died, Philip tried again, this time appealing to Pope Innocent III, a younger, bolder pontiff. But Innocent too stood firm. She is your wife in the eyes of the Lord. To cast her aside is sin. To take another woman is adultery. Philip raged. He called the Pope a foreign intruder. He threatened to sever ties with Rome. He even hinted at declaring an anti-pope, a move of open defiance against the Holy See. But beneath the fury was fear, because Ingeborg, through all this, had not broken. Even in confinement, she wrote, letters etched with desperation in Latin scripture, pleading not just for herself, but for the sanctity of marriage. She reminded the Pope that she had been crowned by God's hand, not just man's, that her silence was not consent, that obedience to abuse was not holiness. And still, she waited. Meanwhile, Philip moved on. In 1196, he married another woman, Agnes of Morania, a Bavarian princess famed for her beauty. The French court celebrated. The public rejoiced. At last, a queen they could adore, one who smiled and danced and gave Philip the airs he so craved. But to the church, this was blasphemy. For as long as Ingeborg lived, Agnes was no queen. Their children were illegitimate. France stood under threat of excommunication. Innocent III held the sword of divine law over Philip's crown, and in 1200 he struck. A papal interdict was issued. All of France was placed under spiritual lockdown. Masses ceased. Churches closed. No marriages could be sanctified. No dead could be buried in holy ground. The people, once jubilant, turned restless. Philip faced rebellion from both nobles and clergy. His kingdom, so proud, so Catholic, began to rot from within, not with swords, but with silence. The same silence he had forced upon Ingeborg. Cornered, he relented. In 1213, 20 years after their wedding, Philip publicly restored Ingeborg as queen. He claimed to accept the church's ruling. He paraded her beside him at royal functions. He issued charters in her name. But it was all theater. Behind the scenes, nothing changed. She was still isolated, still guarded, still treated like an inconvenient reminder, of a shameful past. Agnes had died in 1201, her children raised in uncertainty. But Ingeborg? She still lived. Not triumphant, not avenged, just enduring. She had outlived disgrace, survived political storms, and withstood 2 popes and a king's fury. But what she had not been allowed to do, what she would never be allowed to do, was speak. Speak of what truly happened that night. Speak of what Philip had done. Speak of who she was, because to speak for Ingeborg was to threaten the myth of royal sanctity. And silence was safer. For him, never for her. The walls were not high. The doors were not chained. There was no official proclamation, no iron sentence, no public display of punishment. And yet, when Ingeborg stepped into her new quarters, what the royal records politely called a place of retreat, the world she knew sealed itself behind her like a tomb. She had been Queen of France for one day. Now she was no one. No trial, no hearing, just absence. The chamber was a manor, technically, a remote religious house near Étampes, south of Paris. It had once been meant for aging nuns or royal widows, quiet women with quiet pasts. Its corridors echoed with hushed prayers and sandal steps. It smelled of old wood, faint mold, and resignation. It was, in every way, a place where women went to be forgotten. Ingeborg did not enter as a widow. She entered as a wife denied. At first, she refused to believe it would last. This could only be a misunderstanding, she reasoned. A moment of madness from a grieving king, a temporary measure to pacify restless courtiers. She waited for the summons to return, waited for the Pope's orders to land like thunderbolts on French soil and tear the veil of injustice away. But weeks passed, then months, then years. The walls did not move. Her servants were stripped away. French staff replaced them, loyal not to her but to the king. Her letters were screened, censored, intercepted. When she tried to speak to local clergy, they shook their heads and offered platitudes. "Have faith, Majesty," they said. "Obedience is its own strength." She did not scream, she did not strike. But she wrote dozens of letters, long, aching prayers disguised as petitions. Some addressed to Pope Celestine III, others to her brother King Canute VI of Denmark. Some were confessions of despair, others pleas for justice. Many never left the house. She wrote in Latin, sharp, clean Latin taught to her by priests in Denmark. She signed them Ingeborg, Queen of France, not out of arrogance, but out of defiance. To erase that title was to admit she had been defeated, and she had not yet bled. But silence, in time, wounds deeper than blades. She was not tortured in the classical sense. No rack, no branding iron, no public flogging. Instead, she was bled through invisibility. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. Doors locked without keyholes, gardens she could see but not touch. No mirrors, no news, no music. Ingeborg began to pray compulsively. The Psalms became her companions. She whispered them to herself in the dark, rocking gently on the edge of a straw mattress, as if the rhythm of holy verse could hold her mind together. "Deliver me, O Lord, from the hand of the wicked. Let me not be ashamed, for I have called upon thee." And then there were the voices, or perhaps just memories. Sometimes she claimed she heard her brother's voice in the wind. Other times her own name repeated in the rustle of tapestries. The local priest grew concerned. He reported to the bishop that the queen was not herself. She smiled too slowly. She stared too long at walls. She wept when bells rang. But the court didn't care. Philip had moved on. He held court with Agnes. He celebrated births. He negotiated treaties. And whenever the Pope threatened to excommunicate, Philip would nod, offer vague concessions, and delay action until the next papal envoy died of old age. Ingeborg was a ghost in his political machine. To the few Danes who managed to visit, diplomats, clergy, and in one case, a distant cousin posing as a pilgrim, the transformation was chilling. The once regal girl of Denmark now walked barefoot on stone, her hair thinned and veiled, her speech soft like candle smoke. But the fire had not gone out. Ingeborg still wrote, still resisted. And she began keeping copies of her letters. Pages hidden under floorboards, messages sewn into hems of gowns, codices disguised as psalters. One, written to Pope Innocent III, contained a line that still haunts medieval historians. They tell me obedience is my salvation. But if I obey injustice, does it not damn us both? This was not the cry of a mad woman. It was the voice of a woman who understood her place in history and knew that silence, even under the guise of piety, was complicity. But by now, years had passed, and while the church thundered and Denmark protested, no one sent armies. No doors were broken, no ropes thrown over stone walls. Because Ingeborg, though queen by law, was a diplomatic inconvenience, and kings are rarely punished for what they hide, only for what they expose. And so, the chamber remained locked. Not with a key, but with apathy, the most dangerous kind of prison. By 1200, Ingeborg had spent nearly 7 years in isolation. Her health was failing, her influence non-existent, and yet, her marriage remained legally intact. The Pope, now Innocent III, upheld her claim with increasing force. France trembled beneath the threat of interdict. But the woman at the center of it all? She was praying, alone, in a room where time had stopped. And in that stillness, something else began to rot. Not her body, not yet, but the myth of royal righteousness. And when it cracked, it would not be the church or Denmark that exposed the truth. It would be Ingeborg, with ink and silence. She wrote, "Day after day, candle after candle, Ingeborg of Denmark filled parchment after parchment with ink that bled deeper than any wound." The words were not frantic. They were not the ravings of a mad woman. They were meticulous, measured, like scripture recited by a woman who refused to vanish. Some letters were addressed to her husband. Most were not. She had learned early that Philip would not respond. The king who had crowned her one morning and caged her by nightfall had long since moved on, ruling alongside Agnes of Morania as though their union were legitimate, their children pure, and Ingeborg dead. But she wasn't. And her letters, sent to Rome, to Denmark, to the courts of Europe, proved it. To Pope Innocent III, she wrote as a queen betrayed by man, but loyal to God. She referenced canon law, quoted scripture, and reminded His Holiness that to allow a marriage to be broken without cause was to profane the very altar it was sworn upon. My Lord, I was taken with the blessing of the Church, crowned in your sight, and then cast aside like a slave. The bed I was denied has become my tomb. To her brother, King Canute VI of Denmark, she wrote not as a monarch, but as a sister. Do they still speak my name in the frost? she asked. Does my homeland remember the girl it sent away for peace? But Canute's influence was limited. Denmark, though proud, lacked the reach to challenge France directly. Philip had outmaneuvered the Danes, freezing the dowry and threatening war if the issue was pressed. The few envoys that managed to reach Ingeborg were carefully watched, their movements restricted, their words filtered by court agents. And so her letters became more than pleas. They became weapons. She began to record every detail of her treatment, the hours she was kept isolated, the food withheld, the names of priests who denied her confession, the guards who listened at her door. These reports were smuggled to Rome, folded into liturgical scrolls, hidden in wax-sealed reliquaries. Sometimes they arrived months late, sometimes not at all. But when they did arrive, they struck like thunder. Innocent III, fierce, uncompromising, and increasingly furious, declared her marriage valid again in 1199. He demanded that Philip restore Ingeborg not just as queen, but as wife. He cited canon law, appealed to moral authority, and warned that continued disobedience would incur spiritual disaster. Philip responded with mockery. He accused the Pope of meddling in temporal affairs. He claimed the marriage had never been consummated and therefore was void. He called Ingeborg ill in body and soul, though he never presented proof. Behind the walls, Ingeborg read these counterclaims with something colder than rage. Not surprise, not sorrow, but recognition. She understood at last that truth alone was not enough. That a woman locked in a room, however holy, however innocent, could scream into scrolls for eternity and still never be heard. But she did not stop. Each letter became tighter, sharper, more deliberate. Her handwriting never wavered. She ended each one the same way. Ingeborg, by the grace of God, Queen of France. It was not pride, it was resistance, and it began to work. By 1200, after years of defiance, Pope Innocent III acted. He placed France under interdict, one of the most severe punishments the Church could issue. It meant no mass, no weddings, no burials, no sacraments. From the castles of Paris to the hamlets of Gascony, bells fell silent, churches closed, priests wept, the people panicked, the nobles seethed, the dead rotted in fields, unblessed and unburied, all because of a king's pride and a queen's letters. Philip found himself isolated not just from Rome, but from his own realm. His legitimacy was questioned. His marriage to Agnes was deemed unlawful. His children, once seen as heirs, were suddenly bastards in the eyes of Christendom. He delayed. He negotiated. He sent envoys to Rome to beg for leniency. And finally, he agreed, in appearance only, to take Ingeborg back. In 1201, Philip restored Ingeborg as queen. She was moved from seclusion to a more visible residence. She appeared, briefly, in court ceremonies. Her name was whispered again in the halls of power, but it was a lie. Behind the thin curtain of diplomacy, Ingeborg remained a prisoner. She was still guarded, still isolated, still kept from meaningful power. Philip continued to mourn Agnes publicly after her death, even commissioning chapels in her name. His affection for Ingeborg never appeared, not in words nor in acts, and she knew it. Ingeborg continued to write, though less frequently now. Her letters, once full of hope, became meditations, not pleas for justice, but records for eternity. "I no longer write to be saved," she once penned. "I write to be remembered." In the silence that surrounded her, Ingeborg turned inward. She found solace in ritual, in the rhythm of psalms. She stitched her sorrow into tapestries, embedding verses in thread. She taught herself to read Greek. She transcribed passages of the Gospels in her own hand. If her body could not leave its confines, her mind would. And if no one would listen, then history itself would. The letters no one answered became the proof that she had lived, that she had suffered, that she had not submitted. And for a king who tried to erase her, that was the one act he could never undo. By the time a decade had passed since her wedding, Ingeborg of Denmark no longer recognized the world that had once promised her a crown. She had entered France with the dignity of a queen. Now she moved like shadow, silent, slow, fading around the edges. Her confinement by then had lost the pretense of diplomacy. There were no more envoys, no more protests, no more announcements. She was not beaten, she was not starved, but she was denied the one thing that separates a person from a relic: connection. At Étampes, and later at various religious houses chosen by Philip's court, she was surrounded not by jailers, but by walls that spoke nothing. The women who tended to her were loyal to the king. Some were nuns, others were hired caretakers who had learned that silence was safer than pity. They greeted her with curtsies, performed their duties, then disappeared. Days became seasons, seasons, years. The world moved forward. Ingeborg stood still. She was permitted no real visitors, no friends, no fresh air except under supervision. The windows in her chamber were narrow, high, barred not with iron, but with distance. And something inside her began to change. At first it was subtle. She forgot the rhythm of the Psalms, stumbled over Latin verses she once knew by heart. She repeated certain phrases out loud when no one was present. Lines from her old letters, over and over, as if trying to keep herself tethered to the memory of meaning. Later came the dreams. She spoke of voices that whispered through the walls at night. Whispers in Danish, Latin, and a language she claimed was neither. She said Agnes came to her in sleep, barefoot and smiling, cradling a child who would never be king. The sisters reported these episodes. She is not mad, one wrote, but she speaks to things we cannot see. Ingeborg began to sleep sitting up. She tore the hem of her nightgown into strips and wove them into knots, tiny, complex patterns that filled her drawers. She refused to eat from silver. She wept during morning bells, not from piety, but because they reminded her she was still alive. Once a nun found her pressing her hand against the wall, whispering, "Is this what it's like to be remembered?" The church, still formally recognizing her as Queen of France, did not intervene. The Pope had done what he could, forced Philip to acknowledge her, reinstated her title in law. But beyond that, no one came. No horseman thundered down the road with orders of release. No holy army arrived to take her hand. Her captivity had become ritualized, her existence background noise to a kingdom eager to forget. And so, her mind began to fold inward. There are no surviving portraits of Ingeborg, no statues, no detailed descriptions from her later years. Only secondhand notes in convent records describing her as solemn, otherworldly, a woman more spirit than body. But in her writings, those few that survived, glimpses of her unraveling remain. "The sky does not change here," she wrote once. "Only I do. And yet, I remain unseen." In another, I held a crown, I held a pen, now I hold breath. That is all. She no longer signed her letters Queen of France. She simply wrote, Ingeborg, no title, no demand, just a name, as if she were preparing to become her own tombstone. One nun recalled finding her in the chapel late at night, lying prostrate on the cold stone floor, muttering what sounded like a child's lullaby in Danish. When she was gently lifted, Ingeborg looked at her and asked, "Did the sea ever come back? Was it madness or memory? Did the mind of a woman so violently silenced simply break? Or did it invent new language for grief?" What we know is this: Ingeborg did not become the mad queen of legend. There are no records of violence, no outbursts, no destruction. Her madness, if it came, was quiet, like water freezing around a stone, like ink fading from a page, like a voice that chooses, at last, to speak only inward. And yet, through all of this, she survived. That fact alone, in the face of such unrelenting spiritual isolation, is nothing short of astonishing. She did not die in those years. She did not renounce her faith. She did not curse the man who broke her. She endured. And in that endurance, there is something even more haunting than madness. There is will. To exist without being seen. To pray without reply. To hold the memory of one's own name even as it disappears from every mouth that once spoke it. That was Ingeborg's final rebellion. Not noise, not fury, but persistence. Long after Philip had buried Agnes, long after the interdict had lifted, long after France had pretended to forget her altogether, Ingeborg remained. Not whole, but not gone. A queen still breathing inside her tomb. By the time Philip II of France died in 1223, he had reigned for 43 years. He was buried at Saint-Denis among kings, wrapped in velvet and reverence. His tomb was inscribed with honor. His chronicles praised his victories, his wars, his conquests, his devotion to the church. But there was a hole in the record, a silence so conspicuous that it ached like a missing tooth in the smile of history. That silence had a name: Ingeborg. She had outlived him, outlived Agnes of Morania, outlived the Pope who had once fought for her, outlived the whispers that called her mad. And yet, she never returned to court. Even after Philip's death, when the throne passed to his son, Louis VIII, and the interdict was long lifted, no formal restoration was made. There was no procession welcoming her back, no official decree restoring her to full honors, no feast, no apology, just absence. She was still technically Queen Dowager of France. But she lived in quiet obscurity, far from Paris, her name mentioned only in clerical records and papal footnotes. She moved, for the last years of her life, to Corbeil, a small town south of the capital. There, under the vague protection of the church, she lived not in a palace, but in a modest house attached to a priory. A structure built for monastics and penitent widows, not queens. There are no records of her servants, no attendants, no court, just a woman wrapped in wool, walking slowly among tombstones, speaking only when spoken to. And yet, she was not entirely alone. It was in Corbeil that she began to receive letters again. Not from kings, not from bishops, but from nuns. Women from nearby convents had heard of her suffering. Some had read the surviving fragments of her correspondence. Copies passed quietly from hand to hand like relics. To them, she was not forgotten. She was holy. They visited her in secret, bringing baskets of food, swatches of embroidered linen, little psalters marked with dried flowers. A few even wrote poems, calling her the saint in silence, or the queen beneath the veil. To them, Ingeborg was not a madwoman, not a political ghost, but a martyr of endurance. She responded to their kindness not with grandeur, but with gentleness. She still prayed, still walked the garden. She spent hours transcribing scripture by hand, her calligraphy still sharp, unshaken by the years. She sang softly, in Danish. Her voice had grown thin, but it carried strangely well in stone chapels, echoing like the last verse of a forgotten hymn. She never spoke of Philip, never cursed his name. She had buried him long before the grave had. But in one surviving letter, written late in her life to an abbess in Chartres, she did write this: "There is a kind of dying that does not take the body. I have known it well, but I have also known how to live in its shadow." And that is what she became in those years. Not a queen, not a prisoner, but a shadow. She appeared once at a church dedication. She sat in the back, wore black. When a local bishop approached her and asked if she would like to address the congregation, she shook her head and whispered, "I have already spoken, years ago." No one heard me then. She was offered royal funds. She declined. She was offered the chance to return to Paris. She refused. Why? Because what had been taken from her was not just her crown, it was her place in the world. To return now would not be triumph, it would be theater. And she had never been a performer. The very fact that she still lived seemed to unsettle those who remembered her. She had become an embarrassment to power, a reminder that even kings could fail, that even popes could be ignored, that even the mightiest courts could imprison a woman for nothing more than disobedience. Because that is what she had done in the end. She had refused to disappear. And in a world run by men who demanded silence, that was unforgivable. When Louis VIII died in 1226, just 3 years into his reign, Ingeborg did not attend the funeral. She remained at Corbeil, where the stone paths were wet with moss and the wind smelled of leaves. Her prayers grew slower. Her hands trembled now when she wrote. But she never stopped writing. The final entry in her records is from the year 1236. It is not a letter. It is a receipt. A note from a local monk that he had received funds from the Lady Ingeborg to repair a broken roof at the priory. He signed it with thanks. And below his name, in unfamiliar handwriting, someone had written, "She passed peacefully at last." No bells rang in her name. No torchlight procession marked her death. Her tomb was simple, a slab, unadorned. No effigy, no crown, no title. But beneath that stone lies not just a woman, but a silence more powerful than any decree. Because she was meant to be erased, and she was not. Because she was meant to break, and she did not. Because she was buried long before she died, but lived long enough to become the conscience of a kingdom. In 1236, Ingeborg of Denmark died. There were no tolling bells across Paris, no messengers galloping through villages proclaiming the queen's passing, no mourning in the royal court, no black banners hung from the palace walls. Because for France, Ingeborg had died decades earlier. Her death, real, physical, final, was only a formality. She passed away quietly at Corbeil, in a town whose name had barely grazed royal lips. Her body, long thinned by fasting and solitude, was wrapped in plain linen. She was laid not in a marble sarcophagus beside kings and queens at Saint Denis, but beneath a small stone slab, barely marked. Even that location is uncertain. The priory where she lived her final years was later destroyed. Records lost, graves moved. The exact spot of her burial, once a queen's resting place, is now a mystery. Some believe she lies beneath the current church of Saint-Spire. Others suspect her bones were relocated during religious wars. But most simply stopped asking. France did not grieve. At the time of her death, the throne was held by Louis X, later known as Saint Louis, the pious grandson of Philip II. He did not mention Ingeborg in his letters, did not commission a tomb, did not speak her name at court, and why would he? She had no heirs, no land, no power. She had never borne a child, never ruled beside the king, never stood in the council chambers, or walked beside her husband in royal processions. To the French monarchy, she was an administrative footnote, a marriage gone wrong, a papal embarrassment, a quiet error buried in monastic stone. But in that omission lay the truth, because Ingeborg's absence was not historical forgetfulness. It was political convenience. To honor her properly would have been to admit failure of law, of justice, of divine order. To name her queen at her death would have forced France to reckon with the years she spent in a cell while wearing a crown. So instead, they chose silence. It was not until centuries later that her name would resurface, pulled from dust by archivists and ecclesiastics, curious about that strange, unresolved case between the French throne and the papacy. They found letters, petitions, fragments of papal bulls, testimonies from nuns, and when they read them, not as diplomats or kings, but as human beings, they saw it for what it was. A spiritual execution. Because Ingeborg had not merely been abandoned. She had been systematically erased, locked away, discredited, stripped of voice, of agency, of honor. And still, she had endured. And that endurance left a stain. Even among those who supported Philip, there remained an unease in the years following her death. Bishops who once signed off on annulment began to redact their names. Monks wrote treatises defending her piety. A few clergy members in remote abbeys whispered of visions, of a veiled woman walking among the tombs, speaking not with anger, but with infinite patience. Whether or not she was ever canonized, she wasn't. Some convents quietly kept her name in their litanies of prayer. Not as a martyr, not as a saint, but as a reminder. A reminder that even kings answer to God, that even queens who never rule may carry power beyond the grave. That silence does not equal consent politically. Her death brought no upheaval. Philip had already died. Agnes's children had already been legitimized. The war with Rome had long been settled. But spiritually, Ingeborg's life left a chasm in the royal myth. France, so proud of its divine right monarchy, had to contend with the fact that it had caged a queen for no reason other than disobedience. And what had she disobeyed? She had refused to annul her marriage, refused to deny her vows, refused to step aside, vanish, or play the docile victim. She had obeyed only God, and that, in Philip's court, had been her crime. Some historians have argued that her treatment shaped papal policy for generations, that the Ingeborg affair became a cautionary tale in canon law about the limits of royal autonomy in matters of marriage, that the Church, though it failed to rescue her fully, learned from its impotence and grew more aggressive in defending other women in similar positions. But that came too late for Ingeborg. Her body was gone. Her voice, recorded only in letters few read. Her name, fading from the mouths of those who owed her reverence. She had died without crown, without procession, without justice. And yet, not without meaning. Because buried within her story is the terrible power of passive cruelty, of the kind of evil that wears no armor, swings no sword, and yet destroys more completely than war. The evil of forgetting, of silencing, of choosing not to see. And Ingeborg, though buried in obscurity, became a mirror for that cruelty. A woman who never led an army, never plotted rebellion, never spoke ill of her captors, and yet who terrified them enough to be locked away for life. Because her very existence proved that crowns could fall. That legitimacy could be challenged not with daggers, but with dignity. And that a woman made invisible could still cast a shadow long after the torches had gone out. Ingeborg's story did not just disturb France, it rattled Rome. For while the royal court of Philip II buried her in shadows and silence, the Holy See faced something far more dangerous than a scandal. A challenge to its authority. The Church had long claimed the divine power to sanctify marriage. The words spoken before the altar were not merely ceremonial. They were sacred, binding, inviolable. When Ingeborg and Philip wed before the bishops of France in 1193, their union had not just been political. It had been spiritual, indissoluble. So when Philip cast her aside, called the marriage void, and married another woman, he was not merely rejecting a wife, he was rejecting God's law. At first, Pope Celestine III treated it like a grave mistake. He issued warnings, letters, declarations. He reminded Philip that the union had been properly officiated, consummated in the eyes of God and man. He demanded that Ingeborg be restored to her rightful place. Philip ignored him. He convened a council of French bishops, hand-picked, loyal, dependent on his favor, and forced through a decree of annulment under the flimsiest of pretexts: spiritual kinship. A vague, easily manipulated accusation, despite the lack of any real evidence of forbidden consanguinity. That was the first fracture, because Celestine's authority had been openly defied. And worse, his punishment was ineffective. He had no armies, no power to physically free Ingeborg, no way to force the French monarch to act beyond letters and moral pressure. And so, as Ingeborg languished behind cloistered walls, the Church felt its voice begin to tremble. Then came Pope Innocent III, younger, fiercer, less patient. He had seen what happened when rulers ignored canon law, and he would not allow it again. From the earliest days of his papacy, Ingeborg's case became a personal crusade. He reaffirmed Celestine's ruling, declared the annulment illegal, declared Agnes of Marania's marriage invalid, declared her children illegitimate. And when Philip again refused to yield, Innocent went further. He threatened excommunication, not just for Philip, but for any bishop or priest who supported the lie. Philip hesitated, but not for long. In 1200, Innocent struck with the Church's nuclear option. He placed all of France under interdict. It was a spiritual siege. For more than a year, France lived without public mass, without marriages, without baptisms, without funerals. People died unblessed. Children were born outside the grace of the church. Marriages could not be sanctified. The sacraments themselves, the very rhythm of medieval life, were cut off. The pain was not just spiritual, it was political. Nobles began to grumble. Merchants complained of lost trade. Common folk feared damnation. Philip stood alone, and Ingeborg's name, erased in France, was now spoken daily in Rome. It wasn't just a royal matter anymore. It had become a theological crisis. How could the Pope allow one of the Church's most sacred institutions, marriage, to be trampled by a monarch without consequence? And if he failed to defend this queen, what would that say about every woman married under church law? Ingeborg, without ever raising a sword or voice, had become a wedge between thrones and altars. Eventually, the pressure worked. Philip, fearing civil unrest and further isolation, capitulated on paper. He restored Ingeborg's title, brought her back into the public eye, allowed her to be seen, briefly, beside him at court. The interdict was lifted. France returned to spiritual normalcy. But everyone knew it was a facade. Philip continued to withhold affection, kept her isolated, never treated her as a true queen. An innocent third, though satisfied publicly, understood the limits of his power. The damage was done. In Rome, whispers spread through curial corridors. Some feared the papacy had been weakened. Others believed it had asserted unprecedented moral force. Either way, the church had been drawn into a battle it could not fully win, because Ingeborg still suffered and Philip still reigned. The church, for all its proclamations, had proven incapable of rescuing one woman from a royal cage. Its laws could be written, but not enforced. Its truth could be shouted, but not heard. And that failure would leave cracks in its foundation. Years later, theologians would refer to Ingeborg's case in debates on marriage law. Canon lawyers would cite her name in treatises about ecclesiastical impotence. Her ordeal became a reference point, not just of tragedy, but of papal vulnerability. The question remained: what good is the voice of God if kings may cover their ears? The case of Ingeborg created rifts between France and the Vatican, between bishops loyal to Rome and those loyal to Paris, between secular and sacred authority. It forced the Church to re-examine its reach, to consider whether moral pressure alone was enough, to see that even in Christendom, power still bowed to politics. And yet, in its shame, the Church never forgot her. In secret conclaves, in whispered confessions, in the margins of court transcripts, her name lingered, not as a victim, but as a warning that when the divine law is ignored, the soul of the realm decays. That kings may wear crowns, but conscience wears the cross. And that sometimes the most dangerous rebellion is a woman who will not speak the words you give her. Ingeborg, Queen of France, had become a parable of silence, of faith, of the Church's greatest fear, that it might speak the truth and still lose. There is no statue of Ingeborg of Denmark in the halls of Versailles. No portrait hangs in the Louvre bearing her likeness. No crown preserved in glass, no royal dress sewn with her name, no velvet cushion upon which schoolchildren are taught to whisper history. France, so proud of its kings and queens, has no monument to the woman who wore its crown for one day and then bore its silence for 40 years. Her tomb, if it still exists, is unknown. No grand mausoleum, no engraved epitaph, no golden effigy lying in regal repose, not beside Philip, not beside queens, not even within the official records of royal burial. She is believed to have been laid to rest at the Abbey of Saint-Jean in Corbeil, where she spent her final years. But the abbey no longer stands. Its stones were dismantled, its records lost, and any physical trace of Ingeborg's resting place, of the queen who lived like a ghost, was swept away by time, war, and indifference. What remains? A few papal letters, yellowed and torn, fragments of her own writing, Latin so precise it feels carved rather than inked. Mentions in annals, always brief, always hesitant. The Danish queen, the matter with Philip, the interdict, the silence. And perhaps, if you walk the old stones of Corbeil, there is a whisper in the wind, a space where something should have been, a presence that history tried to forget but couldn't quite erase. Because even if her tomb was never marked, her absence became her memorial. There is no clearer monument to injustice than the void it leaves behind. Other queens of France lie beneath statues, eyes closed in marble, hands pressed in eternal prayer. They are honored, remembered, retold. But Ingeborg's memory survives not in bronze or chisel, but in the ache of what was denied her. The denial of burial with dignity. The denial of her name chiseled in stone. The denial of legacy. And yet, somehow, her shadow endured. Centuries after her death, French clerics began to whisper her name again, quietly, cautiously. A few monks transcribed portions of her letters into theological debates about marriage and obedience. Canon lawyers cited her case as a precedent when advising future popes on royal annulments. And in Denmark, she was never quite forgotten. In the monasteries of Roskilde and Odense, where her brothers once walked, her name remained. Not as a political figure, but as a woman wronged. A sister sent away for peace. A daughter sacrificed to a foreign crown. A queen denied even a queen's death. In the late Middle Ages, nuns in Denmark began lighting candles on June 14th, the date of her wedding. Not to celebrate a union, but to mourn a departure. They called it the Long Night of the North. The night Denmark gave away its daughter and never saw her return. And so, she became a ghost story in velvet. A cautionary tale told not in battlefields, but in cloisters, of what happens when a woman refuses to say yes to injustice. Of what it costs to hold on to your vows when the world tells you to surrender them. Her tomb, wherever it lies, may be bare. But it is not empty. It holds the weight of unshed tears, of letters never answered, of decades lived without warmth, of prayers whispered into stone. And perhaps that is her greatest legacy. Not the one France intended, not the one carved in alabaster, but one etched in moral memory. Because in forgetting her tomb, France revealed something deeper. That a nation may build palaces and courts and cathedrals, but it cannot bury truth forever. One day, centuries after her death, a historian opened a dusty box in a Roman archive. Inside was a letter, unfinished, written in a trembling hand, signed only, Ingeborg, servant of God. It read, "If I am not seen in life, let me be heard in eternity. For silence has a voice, and it does not die. Today, No pilgrim lights candles over her grave. No mass is sung in her name. But if you listen, very quietly, beneath the thrones and chapels of Europe, her voice lingers, a rustle in the parchment, a breath behind the stone, a crown that never fell, but was never worn. The forgotten tomb of Ingeborg is not a place. It is a question, a wound, a reckoning, and it will never be completely closed. History remembers kings for the lands they conquered, for treaties signed, wars waged, dynasties forged in blood and ambition. But what of the queens who never ruled? What of the women who were not vanquished by war, but by being unseen? Ingeborg of Denmark never raised an army. She never shouted in court or plotted revenge. She didn't poison her enemies or flee to foreign shores. She simply stayed. She stayed faithful to her vows, to her name, to the belief that silence, endured, recorded, offered to God, could be more powerful than any crown. And that may have been her most terrifying trait. In a world where kings demanded obedience and queens were expected to smile and vanish, Ingeborg did neither. She refused to vanish, refused to be convenient, refused to lie, even in confinement, even in despair, even when her letters went unanswered and her name was spoken only in disdain. She held on to something her captors could not take, her integrity. And that, perhaps more than anything, is what frightened Philip II. Because power fears stillness. It fears the kind of woman who does not break, who does not beg, who does not perform. Ingeborg's tragedy is not only that she was wronged, but that she was right and still suffered. That she held the law, the truth, the church, the crown itself on her side, and still was silenced. That she embodied the very virtues medieval society claimed to honor: faith, fidelity, humility, and yet was punished for all of them. And we must ask, what does it say of an age or of ourselves? That a woman can be erased not for sin, but for dignity. Her story does not end with fireworks or redemption, no late justice, no royal apology, just time and silence. But silence has memory, and memory is where Ingeborg now rules. I have read of queens with crowns forged in rubies and gold. I have studied women who held power through charm, cunning, seduction, or rebellion. But Ingeborg of Denmark? She held nothing but conviction. And it broke her, or so they thought. But as I finish telling you this story, I can't help but feel she's still here. Not in marble, not in portraits, but in the quiet defiance of every woman who refuses to be silenced. In the teacher who speaks truth no one wants to hear. In the prisoner who holds on to hope. In the mother who is left behind but continues to pray. In every soul told to step aside and instead stands, gently but firmly, still. I do not admire Ingeborg for her royalty. I admire her for her silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the silence of endurance. She was meant to be erased. She was not, and for that, I remember her. And now, so do you.